So we're going to turn to our final panel here this afternoon on alcohol impairment, warning labels, and cognitive processes. And we have two speakers. I think, hopefully, Bill Kerr, are you on the phone? Or can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm here. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. And you are the senior scientist and center director of the Alcohol Research Group. And as you can tell, we'll be presenting remotely, which we can see him nicely parked in his office, I guess. And then we'll hear from Nick Van Dyke,
Um,
who's in the Department of Psychology at the University of Kentucky. So please, go ahead.
Thanks. So are my slides up, or
Well, you're up. We're
do I
waiting
have to
to
do
see your
anything?
slides here.
Okay. So, great. Well, thanks for having me come to speak. And so I'm going to be talking about some research that I've done over the years on the topics that you were interested in, perceived impairments and sort of drink size, labeling, and warning labels generally. A lot of the studies I'm going to be talking about come out of the National Alcohol Survey. I realized looking through my notes that I didn't really give the details of the sources of information, but I did send all of the relevant papers, so that's all available to you. So the first studies I'm going to talk about are about perceived impairment, and they're coming out of the National Alcohol Surveys, as I said, which is a national frame general population survey. Starting in 1979, it's gone about every 5 years up to the most recent 2015 survey. And they were previously face-to-face. They've been RDD since 2000. So this first, I guess we can go to the perceptions of impairment. The first study I'm talking about actually uses data back to 1979, which is an interesting aspect of it. And we sort of looked at this perceived impairment in two different ways. First, as a follow-up to our questions about the frequency of drunkenness in the past year, we asked people, how many drinks does it take you to feel drunk? Because it's, the subjective drunkenness is a good alternative to our graduated frequency series, which includes different levels of high-intensity drinking. But it's also interesting to know about people's, more subjective ideas about how they were impaired. And this question, how many drinks does it take you to feel drunk, was an important addition to that subjective impairment frequency, because it really does vary quite a lot by individuals, from as little as 1 or 2 drinks up to, people may say 30 drinks. And similarly, more recently, we've been asking people about their frequency of impaired driving in the past year. And as a follow-up to that, we asked, how many drinks do you think you can have over a 2-hour period before your ability to drive becomes impaired? By impaired, we mean you've had too much to drink to drive safely. So we felt like we had to be a lot more specific there about the time period and sort of meaning of impairment, but it's still a fairly subjective measure and shows a lot of variation. So I don't know if we're on the time. I can't really see the slides very well, but we're on the second one. I guess I'll just say when to move along.
Yeah, you're in variations.
Okay, great, thank you. So in this first paper we did, there had been some papers previously particularly from Lorraine Medanek on this topic, but the first one that I was involved with, we looked at trends and predictors of this drinks to feel drunk question. And the result that stood out at first the most was that there was really a steep decline from 1979 to 2000. Nearly 10 drinks for men in 1979 was the mean, and that reduced to about 6.6 in 2000. And for women, it was 5.7 in 1979, reducing to 4.2 in 2000. And we haven't published data since then, but it didn't continue to decline at such a steep rate From what I've looked at, it's been fairly flat for both men and women since then. So that was surprising, and we looked into trying to understand why that decline occurred, and just generally what were the predictors of variation in this subjective drunkenness measure. And as you would expect, we found that higher drinking volume and more frequent 5+ episodes were associated with a higher number of drinks to feel drunk. But maybe somewhat surprisingly, the frequency of drunkenness was associated with fewer drinks. So it seemed like there, the causality mostly ran in the other direction, where people that reported a lower threshold of subjective drunkenness would report more episodes, which was an interesting finding. We also found that older people reported fewer drinks. I think this was, people with more education reported fewer drinks, and among men, black men reported fewer drinks than white or Hispanic men in controlled models. And I think one of the things that really stood out in the analysis, because we had data over time from 1979 to 2000, was that states that had the 0.08 BAC limit as compared to higher limits at that time also reported fewer drinks. So it seemed like the BAC laws actually impacted people's subjective perceptions of impairment. And we thought that one of the mechanisms was in the media when they're discussing drunkenness. Often it's in relation to whatever the BAC law is at the time, and just generally people have some awareness of that. So we thought that was an important aspect for the effect of policy on perceptions in that case. And that's a potential mechanism for a 0.05 BAC law, as we're just starting to see now occurring in the U.S. It's not 100% clear to me that would translate. I mean, people have to take on that 0.05 as meaning drunkenness rather than some lower level of impairment. I don't know. I think that's an interesting area for research as to how they're going to view that or how it's going to be portrayed in the media. So I think we can go to the next slide. So the other angle on subjective impairment that's more directly related to impaired driving is this number of drinks for driving impairment. And this is a more recent paper that I did with Tom Greenfield, where we looked at variation in the meaning of this, not as much the effects over time as in the other paper, but sort of what were the predictors and what were the means and so forth. And we found that this was quite a bit lower than the meaning of drunkenness, a mean of 3.8 for men and 2.7 for women, again with a lot of variation, but most drinkers reported numbers that likely would be below 0.08 if they drank that much in 2 hours. But importantly, some people didn't. They were reporting 6, 8, 10, 15, and so forth, saying they could have quite a bit more. So the heavier drinkers and people who reported actually driving while impaired did have more drinks. But what we found most interesting in this analysis, looking at lots of different predictors, was that black and Hispanic drinkers reported about one more drink than white drinkers, looking at the three main race ethnicity groups that we sample or oversample in the NAS, after controlling for other predictors. And we looked at people who had impaired driving and not. We used quantum regression modeling to look at differences in the relationship across the distribution of the dependent variable. And at the low end, where people were, on the average, people were just reporting 2 or 3 drinks to get drunk, as well as on the high end, this difference was consistent. So we thought that was interesting, and it potentially suggests some cultural difference in thinking about driving for impairment. And we have not been able to follow this up yet, but we think it's something that's potentially important and of interest for trying to prevent impaired driving. So we can go to the next slide. So coming out of this, okay, now I can see it well, thanks. So coming out of this, you know, I wouldn't say that I know what the effective strategies are to correct misperceptions. We haven't really been able to follow up this research as much as I would like. But it seems like two potential targets for reducing misperceptions about impairment would be, one, heavier drinkers who are saying that they can drink 6, 8, 10 drinks and still drive. Clearly there's an issue with those people that might have been obvious already. But maybe more interesting would be this idea that Black and Hispanic drinkers do have different beliefs for some reason, and I think that, you know, more research on trying to understand where these beliefs or perceptions come from and what kinds of information might be related to, you know, reducing those reports of how many drinks people think they can have would be useful. I'd also note that in our drinks to get drunk, we found that Black drinkers reported fewer drinks, I think Black men in particular. So there's something different about this perception related to impaired driving than drunkenness per se, and I think that's an interesting angle to follow up on as well. Next slide. So moving on to warning labels, I think the first thing I would note is I've not actually studied warning labels on alcohol containers or in venues or anything like that. And I know you talked to Tom Greenfield in the past, who's the main person here at ARG that studied those. But basically, research suggests that people do notice warning labels, they do recall information from them, and there was one study that suggested that this awareness from the warning labels could increase willingness to prevent impaired driving by others, or at least bring the issue up compared to people who hadn't been exposed to the warning labels. The only related thing I'm doing now is some work on alcohol use in pregnancy, where we're looking at the mandated warning signs in bars and liquor stores and so forth. And we're finding that does reduce drinking among pregnant women. Another study I just noted a couple weeks ago was just published finding the same thing. So I think there's certainly information suggesting that warning labels, either in venues or on containers, can be important for awareness and have impacts. So next slide. So one related area that I've studied quite a lot, and we think might have some relevance to this issue, is drink alcohol content variation, because it's definitely related to alcohol intake by individuals. To some extent, they know they're having bigger or smaller drinks, but in some cases they don't. So it can definitely feed into misperceptions of intake, at least in relation to standard drinks, and result in levels of impairment that might have been unexpected in a particular situation, for example, particularly maybe a novel situation where people were expecting to drive, but it turned out they drank more than they had planned. So it's worth understanding how these things vary across individuals and contexts. So drink alcohol volume varies quite a lot. The sources include beverage type and subtypes of beverages, the context in which the drinking occurs, home, bars, restaurants, parties, and so forth. There are gender differences, age differences, and we've found racial differences as well. So the larger types of drinks that would be, probably the ones of more concern would be home-poured spirits drinks, especially where people are pouring without ice, in large glasses or without mixers. And I think the common theme there is when there's a difficulty in figuring out how much you're pouring, or perhaps you're pouring in that way because you're intending a very large drink, pouring an ounce, standard drink is about 1.5 ounces of 40% alcohol spirits. That's a very small amount and a difficult amount to pour precisely. So, having a tall, thin glass with ice in it it's actually a lot easier to see small differences in the volume than a wide glass without ice and so forth. So we definitely see differences in pouring there. And this is actually coming from studies where we had people pour drinks at home in their own glassware using water and then measure them using measuring beakers that we mailed to them to ensure accuracy. So we think that this is relevant to people's actual drinks and accurately measured. In bar studies where we sent groups into bars and restaurants to purchase drinks without awareness of bartenders or staff that we were doing these measuring activities, and then we would measure the amount of beer or wine, or with spirits we'd have to, it was a more complicated process where we'd have to pour it off the ice and measure the volume and take a sample for analysis so we could get the ABV. But doing all that, we found that at bars and restaurants in Northern California, spirits and wine drinks were about 1.5 standard drinks, or 0.9 ounces of ethanol, which is a lot on average, and that some drinks like martinis or Manhattans tended to be more like 2 standard drinks. The only drink that was actually often a standard drink was a shot poured into a small shot glass, because the glass was 1.5 ounces and you couldn't actually pour more in there. So the next slide. In analysis, we found that men reported pouring stronger drinks than women on average. Those over 50 had lower alcohol content drinks than younger people. We didn't see much difference in groups below 50. We did one study where we focused on race ethnicity differences that had some interesting findings. We found higher drink strengths for Black and Hispanic drinkers, and particularly large drinks poured by Black men compared to white men, about 0.79 ounces versus 0.66, which was significantly higher. And we found that this was mirrored in our on-premise study. In our random sample, we didn't oversample or look for any particular kind of bars. So we only ended up going to 2 bars with predominantly Black patrons. We did keep track of characteristics of the bars. But what stood out about those is they had dramatically higher or larger, stronger, I guess you'd call them spirits drinks, 35 milliliters of ethanol versus 25 milliliters in all the other bars, essentially. So we thought that was an important aspect. It might be related to, again, sort of a cultural difference in drink pouring norms. And we have been interested in following up that and have made some efforts to get funding to do so, but haven't had any luck so far. But we think, again, that's an important area for future research in terms of bars in areas with different ethnic mixes, or bars that certain groups go to more than others. And so that's obviously 2 bars isn't proving anything, but that's a suggested possible issue. So turning to the next slide. Labeling relevant alcohol content. So related to this issue of drink alcohol content, one way to try to help people understand how large their drinks are, to track their drinks, is labeling of alcohol content, or standard drink labeling. So the literature on this is not large. There is an international literature, and there is standard drink labeling in some other countries, including Australia and New Zealand, where I think most of the specific research on this topic is coming from. Studies from different places suggest moderate levels of awareness of the concept of standard drinks. Pretty much all countries have a standard drink, but they differ from each other. But the U.S. people have moderate awareness of what our standard drink is, 0.6 ounces of ethanol. But there's poor knowledge of the actual amounts, and also when you ask, in studies where they've asked people to pour a standard drink into different kinds of glassware, people tend to overpour those drinks, whether it's with beer, wine, or spirits, and probably especially with spirits, which is the most difficult. And one connection to our bar research, I think, is that the fact that we found that wine and spirits drinks were actually a drink and a half in terms of standard drinks, and that beer pints also are larger than standards, even though beer bottles are mostly pretty close to standard. That might feed into this overestimation, because one way that you might think people would think about what a standard drink is, well, what do I usually get at a bar or restaurant? That must be a normal drink. And if they're thinking of that as 1.5 drinks, that's definitely going to lead to sort of over drinking relative to any recommendations. The next slide, please. But while standard drink labeling, I think, is something that would be great to have, or at least ABV labeling on all beverage types, it's complicated by a number of factors. And one of those is nutritional labeling. And I know there's been some efforts to get the TDP to mandate nutritional labeling on alcoholic beverages. And the conflict is that because there's differences in ABV within beverage types, for both wine, beer, and spirits, you could have a 4% beer, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so forth. The standard drink pour is going to be a different amount. So would you mandate nutritional information in terms of standard drinks and keep that all the same, so the pour sizes would differ, and you would think about how many calories were in the pour size for a standard drink? Or more like normal nutritional labeling, there would be a pour size for beer, and you'd want the information in terms of that, so there'd be different numbers of standard drinks for that pour size. And that's, I think, a significant challenge, deciding which of those to go with in implementing standard drink labeling. But my view is that the nutrition stuff really isn't very important for alcohol. I mean, it's alcohol. People don't necessarily need to think about all that. For the most part, it doesn't have much in terms of nutrition, and the focus should be on standard drink labeling to include percent ABV, the volume of the beverage that's in a standard drink, and the number of standard drinks in a container. And those are 3 different pieces of information, all related, that people could potentially use to figure out how much they're drinking. And there is some difficulty internationally too, because the U.S. standard drink of 0.06 ounces is fairly well accepted. It fits pretty well with typical drinks that people actually have in the U.S., which is different from some other countries that have smaller standard drinks. But it does vary internationally, and there isn't really a consensus even on what a standard drink is internationally. Next slide, please. So other labeling issues, beer often in containers, are 12 ounces. If it's 5%, that's a standard drink. Light beer is a little lower, so that works pretty well. But there has been an increase in craft and imported beers with higher ABVs, and there the labeling is going to be more important to let people know that that ABV is higher, or that there is more than one standard drink in a container. Wine also varies considerably in ABV, and the drink size could vary depending on that, and spirits as well. And with spirits, I think even more importantly, this pouring issue, even if people know what a standard drink is, actually implementing it is difficult, and people may not be willing to take the time to measure their pours and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. So this is illustrated in these 3 graphs. Looking, the upper left is one for beer, and you can see that there are now beers like Miller 64 and similar ones that are 2.8%. Standard drink of those is 22 ounces. Light beer would be 14, but as you get up to 8% ABV, it's only an 8-ounce pour for a standard drink, and that's where it becomes important for people to recognize these things. With wine, there definitely are wines below 11%. The sort of standard is around 12%. But today, many wines are above 13.5%, 14, 15%. And the standard pour for those is 4 ounces. So that's, wine is definitely an issue around standard drinks because we do have more of these higher ABV wines. The restaurant pours tend to be large. Wine glasses tend to be very large, which, encourages over pouring. So, that's certainly an area of concern. And then again, for spirits, most of them are 40% alcohol, but when they vary, the standard pour would vary there as well. Next slide, please. All right, so we're towards the end. Recent trends in drink alcohol content. I'm not fully aware of all of these, but my impressions are, as was mentioned, that there are more craft beers with higher ABVs. That's something of a concern and requires, I think, more information for people to be aware of that. More sales of wine with higher ABVs relevant to drink sizes. One major trend has been beverages attempting to mimic the other beverages, particularly where other beverages are having success. This started, maybe 15 or 20 years ago with flavored malt beverages with spirits branding. But more recently, because wine and spirits have become relatively more popular than beer, those are the growing categories, we've had more of these malt-based beverages, which have a tax preference over wine and spirits, with characteristics like spirits, like Bud Light Lime-A-Ritas or Four Loko, where they're flavored. They could basically have been made with spirits, but they're made with malt, and they have high ABV. So those are a special concern. But there's also more low ABV beers, which is an opportunity if those could be encouraged. And we do have the sales shift from beer towards wine and spirits, but beer is still the most popular beverage, and it's especially the most popular among young people, so still an important area. And a little bit off the specific topic I would ask to speak on, but just in thinking about this, if you haven't talked about this already, I continue to think that taxes are a good way to reduce alcohol problems of every kind. And one of the issues with U.S. alcohol taxes is that they're generally on beverage volume rather than alcohol. And, beer, but, wine and spirits as well, or spirits at the state level and wine as well, tax on the ethanol basis to discourage these higher ABV versions within a category, I think could be very helpful, along with, a general increase in the tax level. Per se, even though probably should keep spirits taxes higher than beer taxes. So that's just a closing thought. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks to you, Bill.